pleasure to be here with you all today. I think I'm willing to bet that my experience here at the Audie Murphy VA Hospital predates any of yours. In 1973, when this hospital opened for the first time, I was an intern at this facility. I was 25 years old. You may have come the same time I came, but you certainly didn't predate me. I remember it was a much smaller facility in those days, and I've grown old along with the facility, but I think those of you that work here know what an excellent job we've all done over the years to give care to our veterans of South Texas. So I was proud for my 3-year association with this hospital. So you've heard a lot about aging today. You've heard about frailty today. I want to talk to you about another concept in aging called resilience. It's a little more upbeat topic, and I think it's an important topic. We're going to talk about three subjects today. What is successful aging? And what do we mean when we use the term resilience? And finally, what is creative resilience? So, you know, my interest in these questions were sparked in the main as I cared for my patients over really the last 40 years. I have to ask myself from time to time why some of my patients did so well. They seemed to live so long despite multiple comorbidities, while others succumb so quickly. What is at work here? You know, surely it can't all be genetics. It can't be immunology. It can't just be lifestyle. It certainly can't be herbal supplements. So, as a doctor, as a clinician, I've had a disease-oriented approach to all of this. You know, it was the cancer or the heart failure or the dementia that took my patient. But there's much more to it than I've come to believe over the years. You know, those of us who see a lot of patients, care for a lot of people, after a while we begin to feel that we can pretty much sit down with someone for just a few minutes and identify whether or not that individual is aging well. I've come to question that assumption. Some of us might believe that we can even make that distinction, whether someone is aging well or not, based on just a photograph. And I'm going to show you some photographs of some aging folks in this talk that were taken by my friend Jeff Levine, who's a Manhattan-based geriatrician and an award-winning photographer. So let's look at a couple photographs. Well, here's a guy, an elderly gentleman on this horse at a rodeo. What would we say about him? You think he's aging well? He looks like he's aging pretty well, doesn't he? All right, how about these old biblical scholars? They're elderly, but they're intent on their studies, on their books. Would you say they're aging well? They look to be aging pretty well, don't they? So, what's successful aging? You know, there's been a lot of studies to try to determine what do we really mean when we say successful aging. Here's some summaries of some of these studies. Being free of major chronic conditions or the absence of disease, the ability to function independently, the absence of physical impairments, the upper 20% of individuals who retain the most vigorous physical functioning, absence of physiological decline, having no more than one disease with high physical function, being free of cardiovascular disease, cancer, emphysema with intact physical and cognitive function, being in the top third of physical and cognitive function. These are all been descriptions of successful aging in the medical literature. But I want you to note that these definitions tend to focus on only physiological defects as barriers to successful aging. And after 40 years of research, most constructs on successful aging are still unidimensional. Currently, there's no consensus on a standard definition. Well, then maybe what we ought to do is just look at centenarians, people that live to be 100 years old. Maybe we should look at centenarians. I mean, we're all striving to live to be 100. Isn't that the magic number? We as a society spend billions on aging research to try to get us all to live as long as we can. So let's look at centenarians. This is a summary of a number of studies on centenarians. Well, it turns out that 40 to 50% of centenarians are demented. 1/3 need assistance to eat, half to toilet, 2/3 to dress. The mean number of illnesses among centenarians was 4.3. Only 12% of centenarians were non-demented and functioned well physically and still living at home. So the conclusion that I make from these studies is that healthy centenarians do not exist, but autonomous centenarians do. So these studies all demonstrate that it's very difficult to reach an advanced age yet remain free of comorbidity and some degree of disability. And yet, despite these changes, functional adaptation and autonomy may still be attainable. So we all age differently. Yet, there are multiple pathways to successful aging. Perhaps it's possible to age successfully as long as it's possible to compensate for the deficits and limitations that our individual physiologies impose on us. So that brings us to this concept of the compensatory psychosocial mechanisms of aging. And here are a few. Emotional vitality, resilience, which we're going to talk about specifically, coping, optimization, spirituality, and social ties, giving and receiving social support. In this model, if you think about this model, and I'm going to put another slide on. In this model, psychological and or social mechanisms can help us compensate for our physiological, our biological decline. And those compensatory mechanisms will allow some of us to age successfully while others of us do not. So you see how this Venn diagram, how the physiological, the psychological, and the sociological domains can overlap, and it's in these areas of overlap where we find compensation for what we're lacking physiologically. So this tripartite model on the psychological domain, where it says emotional vitality, we have seen that one compensatory mechanism is resilience. So let's look at a couple of more photographs. Who is the more resilient elder? Well, we've got an elderly gentleman here, one of the Tuskegee Airmen. He's there. He's happy. That's his grandson with his arm around him. I really love this photograph. Or you might look at this picture. Here's an elderly woman in New York City on the street, and you look at her and you say, well, gee, that's a pretty pitiful photograph. But I want you to step back a minute and look a little more closely. There she is. She's sitting there. She's got her walker decorated with little angels. She's got her little sign raising money for medical bills. She's playing the harmonica. She's coping. In some way, she's coping. So let's get a definition of resilience. You know, the concept of resilience has been around a long time, but most of the literature on resilience has appeared in just the last 10 years. I took my definition from this book, Resilience in Aging, edited by Barbara Resnick. And I think a good summary of what resilience is that it's conceptualized to reflect an effective response to some type of adversity or challenge, whether it be physical, psychological, economic, political, environmental, or social. It's a very comprehensive definition of resilience. But it's an effective response. And the response can be a psychological response, a physiological response, social response. There's actually a scale that's been developed, the Wagnall Resilience Scale. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but they measure resilient, what appear to be resilient individuals on a number of scales: equanimity, perseverance, self-reliance, existential aloneness, and spirituality and meaningfulness. So, when we talk about older adults, many of them have life experiences that result in significant strengths and capabilities, allowing for successful coping with the multiple adversities they may encounter. So a more comprehensive definition of resilience encompasses the developmental processes of being mindful and prioritizing behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that facilitate their contentment within a specific developmental, physical, emotional, and spiritual context. So think about applying what we might know about resilience to identify interventions such as, say, life review or reminiscences or other creative processes that tap into the resilience of individuals and might stimulate or enhance it in order to facilitate successful aging. Now, this brings me to a subset of resilience, which is creative resilience. And the study of creative resilience in aging is really just now coming into its own. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that creativity can continue well into our oldest years, and that exercising the parts of our brain that are responsible for our creativity, for making these multiple synaptic connections in our heads that characterize us as fully humans, not only enhances our daily lives, but keeps our minds sharp and supple. The scientific basis for this phenomenon, the why and the how, it's all still in its infancy. But we're getting some insights into the actual scientific basis, what's happening at the level of brain neurons and neurotransmitters. We're beginning to get to that level. But it does appear that patients, even with mild to moderate dementias, can not only participate in creative acts that bring them fullness and joy, they can also appreciate the creative acts in others in a way and to a degree that have not heretofore been realized. So I'm going to take you through some examples of the creative powers of some well-known members of our own species, and I get most of these from this book called The Creative Age that was put together by Dr. Gene Cohen, who some of you might know. He's the founding director of the National Institute of Aging and a groundbreaking researcher in the field of mental health and aging. So this beautiful chapel was designed by the Dominican, this is the Dominican chapel in Valence in France, by Henri Matisse at age 82. There he is, painting in his old age. He figured out a way, maybe too weak to stand, but he figured out a way to paint in bed. Anybody know who did this one? This is a famous painting by Renoir. He was unable to walk as he neared 70. His fingers were no longer supple, but despite this, he continued painting. He did this painting, The Washerwomen, when he was 76. He also had a paintbrush attached to his hand. This is Mary Cassatt, who is another renowned Impressionist painter. Did this painting at age 64. It doesn't sound too old to us today, but remember, during the time she lived, the average age of death was not even 50. Who knows who painted this? So this is Grandma Moses, or Grandma Moses. Anna Marie Robertson Moses was born in 1860 and lived to be 101. She didn't even begin to paint until she was in her late 70s and produced 1,600 canvases over her 3-decade career as a painter. There she is. So who designed this building? So this is the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright at the age of 91, the year he died. You all know who this is. It's Einstein. So in 74, he produced his famous paper, The Meaning of Relativity, which included the unified field theory. And he once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Another famous author, this is Agatha Christie. She wrote up until practically the minute she died at age 86, and her books have sold more than 100 million copies. That's Tolstoy, who lived to be 82, productive to the end. And he said this, I remembered very vividly that I am conscious of myself in exactly the same way now, at 81, as I was conscious of myself at 5 or 6 years of age. Consciousness is immovable. You know, I feel like the same guy that walked into this VA hospital in 1973. Doesn't mean that I am, but I feel that way in my head. Robert Frost, famous American poet, published in The Clearing at age 88. And then 2 figures from medicine. That's Albert Schweitzer, received the Nobel Prize for his work as a medical missionary at age 77 and published his autobiography, My Life and Thought, at age 74. Who knows who this is? All you nurses out there. Who? That's Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale, who said this. We should have listened more closely when she said this. It may seem a strange principle to enunciate as the very first requirement in a hospital that it should do the sick no harm. They had problems in those days as well, but she was an amazing woman, a nurse, writer, statistician, established the first school of nursing in 1860, St. Thomas Hospital, London. At the age of 88, she was awarded the honorary freedom of the City of London. So that's Gene Cohen and his dad, his 91-year-old father. They were playing cribbage together. And Gene had a couple of quotes I want to share with you about creative potential. Creativity strengthens our morale in later life. Creativity allows us to alter our experience of problems and sometimes to transcend them in later life. Creativity makes us more emotionally resilient and better able to cope with life's adversity and losses. Creativity contributes to physical health as we age. A positive outlook and a sense of well-being have a beneficial effect on the functioning of our immune system and overall health. Creativity enriches relationships. Adult children with optimistic expectations of aging typically are more comfortable discussing issues of aging and other life passages with their parents. Creativity is our greatest legacy. To be creative in later life provides an invaluable model of what is possible as we age. Creativity has distinguished elders as keepers of the culture, those who pass the history and values of family and community on to the next generation. So these are things we probably at some level all know. But if we look around our world today objectively, especially in regards to the rising ageism in our culture, I think that you'll agree with these words written by Gene Cohen a decade ago. Creativity has always been there with aging, but many have not recognized or searched for it in themselves in later life because society has so denied, trivialized, or maligned it with advancing years. You know, we really need more people like Gene Cohen as caregivers and caretakers, because we appreciate leaders like him who not only were teaching us, affirming our beliefs about the importance of the elderly in our culture, but he laid it on the line to policymakers, something that needs to be done these days. To recognize the potential for creative expression independent of age is more likely to bring policymakers to the table, not with a sense of skepticism or worse, cynicism about what is possible, but with a new sense of opportunity, challenge, and one hopes creativity. To think about older adults primarily in terms of decline and disability, or to view them as a national burden, is to overlook their value as a national resource of exceptional potential. So some of you know that over the last few years, I've been teaching a medicine through literature class, introducing some of our medical students to the narrative medicine movement in America, which seeks to honor the stories of our patients' illnesses holistically and to use these stories as teaching guides. Because every one of us has a unique story to tell, our life or the lives of our families, both in sickness and health. And for a few minutes, I want to turn now to my own family story, the one I know best. And for the purpose of my talk today, I believe that the story of my father is very instructive. Here we are about 12 years ago, before our troubles began. My mother and father, Leonard and Francis, are here. There's me and my brother Mike. When I was a child, I remember vividly crawling into my father's lap with a pencil and a notebook, a piece of paper or a notebook, and I'd say, "Draw a dog, Daddy, or a bird or a tree." And he did. It just took him a few deft strokes, and there it was. And I really thought in those days it was magic, those figures coming to life on the paper through my father's hand. I've never been able to do this. Whatever the magic is that he had, it's not in me. This is the earliest photo of my father that I've ever found, and this was just recently, really. And I'm pleased to see that he looks like a happy kid at that time in his life. My father spent his life working 6-day weeks in a dreary shop that is opened by his father, who then had the bad luck to die when my dad was only 7. There it is. This is a picture of my father's parents before he was born. But his mother was an illiterate immigrant who was caught with her family of 6 children in the desperate circumstances of the Depression She had no choice but to take each child in turn out of school and put them to work in the store. And at age 16 and 6 months shy of high school graduation, my father's turn came. And aside from 5 years spent in the Army Air Corps, photographing ground damage after the bombers made their runs, the shop became his life. An old wooden easel, there it is, you can see it in my old club cellar, behind my dog there. An old wooden easel gathered dust in a corner of the basement. And during the years I grew up in that house, I never saw my father but brush the canvas. When I was a teenager, I started working with my dad in the store after school and on Sundays and every summer. And we were driving home together one night after a long, busy day, and he said, you know, when I was in junior high, about your age actually, I had an art teacher who took an interest in me. He sent me home with a note from my mother. She beat me before I could read it to her. I guess she must have thought I'd gotten into some kind of trouble. She didn't need any more trouble. And anyway, when she finally let me read her the note, it said that this teacher wanted me to go to the Maryland Institute of Art. And he made sure I got in and it wouldn't cost anything. And I was just a kid, but I was moved, I remember, even though I didn't really understand my feelings. And I said, so what did Granny say? Nothing, he said. She tore up the note and walked away. But my father did not have an easy life, and he was lucky to have survived the war and worked hard in his little store to eke out a living. And he suffered a major depression when his mother died, when he was in his early 40s. And he finally lost his business at the age of 49. He fell into another long depression. My mother supported him the rest of his life. But in his 60s, my father began to paint. One day, the old easel appeared in a clearing in the garage, and my father set up a series of bright lights and a table on which to place his study objects. He started going to the library almost every day and taught himself art history, returning each evening and talking to my mother about the lives of Renoir and Monet, Picasso and Rousseau. And paintings began to flow from his studio. The roses and irises from his garden, self-portraits and paintings of his family members done from memory in the help of old photographs. His work encompassed every phase of modern art, from the Impressionists. Thank you so much. Could you please turn off your phones and microphones at the remote location, please? From the Impressionists through the Cubists and abstract expressionists, he'd spend hours in the museum studying how each artist applied the paint to the canvas. He experimented with sand and straw, watercolor, oils, and pastels. And I began to hang his works in my medical office, which gave him immense pleasure. My patients would exclaim over them. He even offered to buy them, and my father occasionally would give one away, but he couldn't bring himself to sell any. I'm just a piker, he would say. I don't know what I'm doing. And once, without his knowledge, I entered one of his oil paintings in a local contest and took him to the gallery where all the works were to be hung after judging. And there was this painting, Wild Wren, a white and gold ribbon hanging from the frame, and he had won the competition. And I never saw him happier than on that day. This went on for over 20 years, but then his health began to fail. He had a couple of heart attacks and then prostate cancer. His production slowed, but he kept painting. I began to notice that his works were changing, the perspective dimming, the faces on the portraits less realistic. And then he painted no more. I talked to him, tried to cajole him back into his studio. He'd shrug his shoulders and say, I just don't know what to paint anymore. Could I have done more to encourage his creative resilience? Would this have made a difference in what followed? I don't know the answer, but soon there came the time when I realized he could no longer sign his name. The day came when I had my own story to tell. I was, by then, almost 60 years old, and it became my story, because I was not the doctor to the patient, but rather his son. And my father, sick and disabled and demented, could no longer tell his own story. And I realized at some point during his decline that, as his son, the geriatrician, I had to tell his story. One night, just past his 80th birthday, my mother called me in a panic. "I don't know what's wrong," she said. "He's pacing through the house saying he needs air. He's all agitated." And I rushed over there. He was in congestive heart failure. I called his doctor, one of my younger associates. "I'll meet you in the ER," he said. Well, this was the beginning of a 7-year siege for my family, and the beginning of the end of my father's story. It started in the hospital, where I had made rounds almost every day for over 30 years. No one made any mistakes. My father received excellent medical care, the best available in America today, and his heart failure stabilized. But in the hospital, he developed delirium, and although I stayed with him every minute and got him out of the hospital as soon as I could, his dementia had been unmasked, and he was never the same after that. The difficult days and months and years continued. I struggled with his medications, his incontinence, my mother's concerns and complaints and frustrations, her devotion and her fatigue, his confusion and paranoia, his falls, his struggle to stay upright and independent in the world, his loss of appetite, his inability to recognize his own son, his slow dying by degrees. As many of you know, I wrote about my father's illness, as well as about some more about my life as a geriatrician in this book, which arose out of my caregiving experience. And my interest in creative resilience arose out of this experience as well. After his hospitalization for heart failure and delirium, my father was never the same. His decline was inexorable. But I discovered this. When I visited, even during the worst of times of his paranoia and his belligerency, if I pulled out one of his old art books and sat down next to him, the book opened across our laps and began to turn the pages, he would become engrossed. "Oh, I've always loved that one," he might say. "This is the one, this is his favorite." At the time, I was both heartened and amazed at this simple act of sitting with my father while I looked at these famous paintings that had thrilled and inspired him over his lifetime, could transform him, alter his mood completely, calm his agitation and belligerency. I was not then aware of the body of scientific work slowly building. And as I came to understand with my own father, it has been observed for many years by both clinicians and caregivers that individuals with Alzheimer's disease seem to respond positively to artistic engagement with behavioral changes, with increased smiling, improved moods, and diminished agitation. So there's now this growing body of converging research on resilience in aging, promoting resilience among persons with dementia and their caregivers by using the arts. Artistic engagement can be an important tool for improving quality of life, diminishing problem behaviors, and perhaps even to improve some aspects of cognitive functioning in individuals with dementia. These artistic activities include drawing, music, and dance. And Ann Davis Basting has worked in the applied arts with people in mid to late degrees of dementia for almost 2 decades now. And the core challenge these days is demonstrating the resilience of older adults with disabilities is the attitudes of their care providers. She was instrumental in helping get this Meet Me at MoMA project off the ground. It was the first of its kind at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where professionals, caregivers, and patients come together in an effort to enhance resiliency, not only for those with Alzheimer's disease, but for the rest of us that are all engaged in the process together. So this Alzheimer's disease project began in 2006, and Francesca Rosenberg was the person at the moment to really get this off the ground, and she talks about how what Alzheimer's disease is. We don't need to go into that, but she was instrumental in getting groups of patients with Alzheimer's and their caregivers to come to the museum, specified hours, not when the museum was open to the general public, and participate in viewing 4 or 5 artworks. Each tour lasted about an hour and a half, with 15 to 20 minutes spent on each artwork. There were some discussion questions posed, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the results were rather amazing. Not only were the patients engaged, but the caregivers were engaged, and got just some. These are some of the pictures they used. Some of the patients, and their family members. What's happening? What's happening here? Well, art can tap into one's long-term emotional memories, feelings that somebody may have had in the distant past, relating to events and people in their lives. Looking at art puts patients and caregivers on a level playing field. Both can engage with the work at various levels and feel validated and empowered. Art can be a tool for communication, thereby enabling human and social connection and understanding between patient and caregiver, and between patients and other patients. Art offers the means to make connections between individual experiences and the world at large. So art viewing experiences like the one begun at the Museum of Modern Art are popping up all over the country. The McNay Museum here in San Antonio has a similar program, and there's probably more than a dozen now across the country, and they're being studied by places like the New York University Center of Excellence for Brain Aging and Dementia Study. They're actually doing studies showing that there's decreased social isolation, enhanced self-esteem, fewer symptoms of depression, improved mood, enhanced quality of life, and they're adding to the scientific literature in this regard. There's some slides showing the results, but I'm not going to go into that. The importance of the educator has been demonstrated. Intellectual stimulation, shared experience, social interaction, accepting environment, emotional carryover, and program extension were all important findings of these studies. So in 2004, Suzuki et al. Showed decreased irritability, improvement on the language subscale of the MMSE, along with a decrease in salivary chromogranin A, that's a measure of stress and sympathetic nervous system activity, after 16 sessions of music therapy. And I want to show you a short video that I came across recently. Some of you may have seen it, but it's a pretty amazing video. The older physician in the film, as you'll see, is Dr. Oliver Sacks, who some of you might recognize as the famous neurologist featured in the film Awakening, which chronicled his experiences with L-DOPA in patients with severe Parkinson's disease. So we can play that short video for the audience now.
I have one resident that really opened her eyes, didn't respond. As much as I tried, I've been here for 2 years. No matter what I tried, massage wouldn't work, nothing worked. But when we got introduced to the iPods and the family told me the things that she liked, it was amazing once we put the iPod on her. She started shaking her feet. She started moving her head. Her son was just amazed. Okay, can we stop? Because now I'm getting all I'm seeing her all over again.
How you doing?
All right, fine. Wait.
Who am I?
I don't know. Wait a minute.
Okay, it's Cherry. How long has he been in the nursing home? Approximately 10 years. He was having seizures, and my mother couldn't handle him at all. Of course, it affected me greatly because he was always, fun-loving, singing. Every occasion he would come out with a song, no matter where he was. I remember as a child, he used to walk us down the street, me and my brother, and he would stop and do singing in the rain. He would have us jumping and swinging around poles. He was, he was good. He was always into music, always loved singing, dancing.
His name is Henry Jerald. And looking more or less for religious music for him, because he enjoys music and he always quoted the Bible. So I'd rather have that for him.
You first see Henry inert, maybe depressed, unresponsive, and almost unalive.
Henry,
Yeah.
Henry,
Yes,
I found your music. You want your music now?
What do you want from me?
Let's try your music, okay? And then you tell me if it's too loud or not.
Then he is given an iPod containing, we know, his favorite music. And immediately he lights up. His face assumes expression, his eyes open wide. He starts to sing, to rock, and to move his arms, and he's being animated by the music.
And he used to always sit on the unit with his head like this. He didn't really talk to much people. And then when I introduced the music to him, this is his reaction ever since.
The philosopher Kant once called music the quickening art, and Henry is being quickened, he's being brought to life.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the music for 1 second, okay? Just to ask you a few questions. Okay? I'm going to give it back to you. Okay.
The effect of this doesn't stop, because when the headphones are taken off, Henry, normally mute, virtually unable to answer the simplest yes or no questions, is quite voluble.
Henry,
Yeah.
do you like the iPod? Do you like the music you're hearing?
Yes.
Tell me about your music.
Well, I don't have none, I mean.
Do you like music?
Yeah, I'm crazy about music. You play beautiful music, beautiful sound.
Did you play music when you were did you like music when you were young?
Yes, I went to big dances and things.
What was your favorite music when you were young?
Well, I guess, Cab Calloway was my #1 band guy I like.
What was your favorite Cab Calloway song?
Oh, I'll be on the Christmas. Oh, you can count and on me with plenty of snow, mistletoe, present, Reverend you free out.
So in some sense, Henry is restored to himself. He has remembered who he is, and he's reacquired his identity for a while through the power of music.
What does music do to you?
Give me the feeling of love. No man. Figure right now the world needs to come into music, singing. You got beautiful music in. Beautiful, oh lovely. And I feel the band of love, dream. Lord came to me, made me holy. I'm a holy man. So he gave me this sound. So they say, I meet you. Let me see. Rosalie, won't you love me? Rosalie, won't you be sweet and kind?
With this beautiful new technology, you can have all the music which is significant for you in something as big as a matchbox or whatever. And I think this may be very, very important in helping to animate, organize, and bring a sense of identity back to people who are out of it. Otherwise, music will bring them back into it, into their own personhood, their own memories, their own autobiographies.
So that's Henry's story. It's amazing. It's just amazing. Every time I see it, I get goosebumps. Well, my story, back to my story, you know, my dad, he's gone over 6 years now, and I still think of him every day. You know, I cursed the disease that stole his selfhood, and I was brought to my knees on the day that he could no longer remember my name. But, you know, he was 87 years old by then, and with all nature and nurture arrayed against him, I have to conclude that really he was, in the end, saved by his art, because the practice of his art gave him a new identity. He was no longer a failed shopkeeper. He was an artist, and this is the message for all of us. When we are failing physically and cognitively, dipping into this well of our creative resilience can buoy us. There are some lessons here as we prepare for the boomers. There are some interventions that stimulate and build resilience. You know, disposition attributes such as vigor and optimism and physical robustness, and improving socialization practices, and strengthening self-efficacy and self-esteem and motivation through interpersonal reactions and experiences. Using narrative to share life stories, social remembering, talking with others about shared experience, and of course encouraging creativity through past abilities and interests, while encouraging new and shared creative endeavors and experiences, and of course encouraging spirituality when appropriate. And one more important point, I think, for all of us, you know, tapping into the creative resilience of our elderly loved ones is one important way to decrease the use of psychotropic drugs in this population. And as you've heard and will hear during this conference, that is a very important aspect of what we ought to be doing as healthcare professionals for our elderly, that is decreasing the use of psychotropic drugs. So, who is aging more successfully? Who is more resilient? Here you've got senior marathon runners. The lady here, number 337, is in her 90s. They are running a senior New York City marathon. You think they're more resilient? Or could it be this elderly woman in a caring and loving environment, her daughter by her side? Maybe she is just as resilient as a marathon runner. So we've got to promote successful aging, even if there weren't any budgetary issues. That's never going to be the case anymore. It's essential that we better understand successful aging. But I want to submit to you that you can't tell by a snapshot in time. To do this requires meaningful interactions with our patients, an inquiry into their lives in order to evaluate their life circumstances on more than one domain. The truly successful older individual is someone who has demonstrated resilience and at age 95 with multiple morbidities, optimizes function, volunteers or continues to be actively engaged in meaningful activities, or is simply happy reviewing his or her prior life activities. It is the individual who has a hip fracture and engages fully in rehab and remains determined to return home, or the individual who recognizes cognitive changes with a decline in short-term memory and buys a bigger calendar to write more reminders or cues. So as geriatricians and members of the team, we need to continue to expand our understanding of these domains of aging so that we can continue our best efforts on behalf of our patients. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, I guess we might have a few
Sure,
minutes for
yeah.
questions. Yes, ma'am?
So, the art is important for your father. You're indicating that art could bring out some things whether that was important to them in the past or not, art and the music. Like this gentleman in the movie, of course, music was important to him. If you're proposing that even if that wasn't a big interest in your younger days, you could, kind of.
Yeah, well, of course, my dad was interested in art his whole life. He just he's never had any time to practice his art, but bringing that back to him, he really brought it back to himself, but that helped sustain him in his last 20 years of his life. And yet I also believe that there are people that maybe didn't do art or some other creative endeavor when they were younger, but can still respond to that when they're older and get involved, and that will also help. So it's not just the people that had a love of art or a love of music, but I think let's say many, I can't say most, but many of the elderly people who we think are beyond our help as far as their ability to have this spark of resilience can be, with a little bit of attention and inquiry into their lives, can be helped by these efforts. Yes.
The music in Alive with Henry seems to be such a low-cost approach to alleviating some of these conditions in nursing homes and apathy and aloneness. What are some of the barriers that are preventing us as a society to use these measures?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to be made aware that there can be such a dramatic change in some people. Are any of you involved here in occupational therapy or social work at the VA where you use music to try to improve the lives of some of your older patients or residents? Can you talk about that, what you do?
Recreation therapy, we use music in our areas, the CLC as well as other areas.
So I think that this, for many, many years I worked in nursing homes, and it never occurred to me to get a personal iPod for somebody and ask their family what kind of music they like. But it sure would now. Anything else? Okay. Yeah, oh, yes.
My sister-in-law, her father is in some of the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, in the stage where they get really agitated, and she said it's never heard him curse like he does now, and she happened to put some, he was really out of sorts one day, she had the music going, and she said it was like just a world of difference. She couldn't figure out what to do to get him calmed down, and couldn't believe the difference in how much had the music on it.
Yeah, I think the more we take the time to explore this with our patients, the more we're going to find we can help them in ways we never would have believed.